It started with laughter, Sandra's laughter. Not the kind she gave to the kids when they cracked a silly joke, or the polite chuckle she used with strangers. No, this was her real, full-bellied laugh. The one she used to save just for me. And it wasn't coming from inside our house. It was late, maybe close to midnight, and I was walking back to the garage to grab a wrench. The faucet in the kitchen was leaking again, and I wasn't about to pay a plumber $200 for a 5-minute fix. The cool night air was thick with the smell of fresh-cut grass and damp concrete. That's when I heard it, her laugh, floating through the backyard like a ghost. Confused, I stopped. At first, I thought maybe she was on the phone, sitting out on the patio. But as I walked closer to the sound, I realized it was coming from the other side of the fence, the neighbor's yard. Our neighbor, Jack, is a widower in his late 40s, friendly enough, but not someone Sandra had ever paid much attention to before. I crept quietly toward the fence, more curious than anything. Peeking through the slats, I saw her Sandra, sitting at Jack's patio table, a glass of wine in hand, leaning in close as if he were telling her the funniest story in the world. The way she tilted her head, her hand grazing his arm, it was too familiar, too intimate. My heart stopped. I don't know how long I stood there. Time seemed to warp, bending around the sight in front of me. When Sandra finally stood up, she placed her hand on Jack's shoulder and laughed again, her voice carrying over the fence like a dagger to my gut. She didn't come home until another hour had passed. Something wasn't right. And from that moment on, I couldn't ignore it. It began with the small, nagging details, the kind of stuff you dismiss at first because, honestly, who wants to believe their marriage could be in trouble? But once you've caught a whiff of something rotten, you can't unsmell it. You start to notice things, like the way Sandra started guarding her phone like it held the nuclear codes, or how she suddenly developed this obsession with looking perfect every time she left the house, even if it was just to pick up groceries. The evening after I saw her in Jack's yard, I tried to play it cool. We were sitting in the living room, the kids already in bed, and Sandra was scrolling through her phone with a glass of red wine balanced on her knee. I asked casually, "So, what were you and Jack talking about last night?" She barely looked up. "Oh, nothing. He needed help deciding on paint colors for his living room." "Paint colors?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, Matthew. Paint colors." "Why?" she snapped, her tone sharper than it needed to be. I backed off, but my gut told me to pay attention. That was the first night I didn't sleep. The next few days passed in a haze of suspicion. I hated feeling this way, like some paranoid idiot reading too much into nothing, but her behavior wasn't helping. Sandra had always been open about her plans, always kept me in the loop, but now? Every other evening seemed to include some vague errand, catching up with the girls, or yoga class that stretched later than I thought any gym stayed open. And the phone. God, that phone. She carried it everywhere, bathroom, garden, even into the shower. I started wondering who she was texting and why she couldn't even leave it on the kitchen counter like she used to. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was a Thursday night, and Sandra was getting ready to go out again. She told me it was dinner with her co-workers, a group I knew only from her occasional mentions, people I'd never met. She spent almost an hour getting ready, which wasn't unusual, but this time, she was putting on perfume. She never wore perfume for her co-workers. I tried not to let it bother me, but as soon as she left, I felt like I was going to explode. The kids were upstairs watching a movie, so I couldn't exactly start tearing the place apart looking for answers. But then I saw her laptop on the kitchen counter. Sandra never left her laptop out. I opened it and clicked on her email. Nothing unusual, work stuff, newsletters, spam. Then I remembered something Ella had said a few months ago about Snapchat, how messages there disappear. I wasn't even sure if Sandra had an account, but when I opened her laptop's browser history, there it was, Snapchat logins, the same day she claimed she was at the gym. I couldn't get into the account from her laptop, it needed her phone, but now I knew there was something she wasn't telling me. The next step was pure desperation. The following evening, Sandra said she was meeting a friend for coffee. I told her I needed to run to the hardware store for something and left the house a few minutes after she did. Instead of going to the store, I tailed her. It felt dirty, sneaky, But at this point, I didn't care. She didn't go to a coffee shop. She went to a restaurant downtown. Parking a few spaces away, I watched as she got out of her car, smoothed her dress, and walked inside. 10 minutes later, I saw him, Jack. He walked in, casually dressed, but there was no mistaking him. My blood boiled. I waited. After an hour, I couldn't take it anymore. I went inside, hoping to catch them red-handed. The restaurant was dimly lit, and it took a moment to spot them in a booth toward the back. They weren't holding hands or kissing, but they were leaning close, their heads almost touching, talking in a way that didn't leave much room for interpretation. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I should confront them or not. Before I could make up my mind, Sandra glanced up and saw me. Her eyes went wide, and her face turned pale. Jack followed her gaze and immediately looked away, like a guilty teenager caught sneaking out. Matthew, Sandra stammered, pushing back from the table. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? I echoed, my voice low but firm. The real question is, what are you doing here? She glanced nervously at Jack, who suddenly seemed very interested in his glass of water. Sandra's hands shook as she grabbed her purse. Let's talk outside, she said quickly. We stepped out onto the sidewalk, where the night air felt colder than it should. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at me with those wide eyes, like a deer caught in headlights. Explain, I demanded. It's not what it looks like, she began, her voice trembling. We're just friends. Friends, I repeated, my anger barely contained. You think I'm that stupid? Friends don't meet in secret, Sandra. Friends don't laugh together in the dark while their spouse is at home wondering why everything suddenly feels wrong. She looked like she wanted to cry but forced herself to stay composed. I can't talk about this right now, she said finally. Not here. You can't talk about it because you know I'm right, I shot back. She turned away, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt like I didn't even know who she was. That night, she slept in the guest room, and I lay awake replaying everything in my head. Every laugh, every late-night errand, every time she left the room to answer her phone. I felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. But now I knew, and I wasn't going to let her keep lying to me. When Sandra woke up the next morning, she found me at the kitchen table, a printout of her Snapchat activity in front of me. I had figured out her password overnight. The messages with Jack were there, short, coy, and flirtatious, but damning enough. She didn't even try to deny it when she saw the evidence. How long? I asked, my voice hoarse. She didn't answer. How long, Sandra? Finally, she muttered, a few months. Something inside me broke. The woman I had built my life around had been lying to me for months, and now there was no going back. Sandra's confession, a few months, echoed in my head like a bell tolling the end of everything. I sat there, staring at her, trying to figure out who this person was in front of me. It wasn't my wife. It wasn't the woman I trusted, the mother of my kids, the person I thought had my back. This was someone else entirely. The silence between us stretched unbearably. Sandra fidgeted, unable to meet my gaze. Her hand moved to the edge of the table, fingers trembling slightly as she ran them along the wood grain. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she didn't. I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. You're telling me this has been going on for months? I asked, keeping my voice low to avoid waking Ella and Ben upstairs. How could you lie to me like that? To them? Do you even care what this does to our family? Sandra's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare talk to me about the kids, Matthew. I've been a good mother. Good mother? I interrupted, my voice rising despite myself. You've been sneaking around with Jack while our kids are upstairs asleep. You've been lying to their faces every single day. That's not a good mother, Sandra. She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. If this was going to hurt, it was going to hurt both ways. She didn't get to play the victim here. I wasn't happy, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I haven't been happy for a long time. Not happy? I repeated, my jaw tightening. When were you planning to tell me? Or was it easier to just go behind my back and let Jack play therapist? It wasn't like that, she snapped. It started with, she stopped, hesitating as if choosing her words carefully. It started with a conversation. That's all. I didn't mean for it to turn into anything more. But it did, I shot back. And don't insult me by pretending otherwise. Do you think I'm blind? I saw you two at the restaurant. You don't look at someone like that unless something's going on. She folded her arms across her chest, her defenses rising. Fine. Yes, I like the attention, Matthew. Is that what you want to hear? Jack listened to me, he made me feel. What? I cut in. Special? Wanted? Spare me the excuses, Sandra. If you had a problem with our marriage, you should have come to me. You don't fix things by screwing around with the neighbor. I didn't screw him, she said, her voice cracking. We never slept together. I let out a bitter laugh. Right. So all those late nights, those secret meetings, that was just, what? Platonic? You expect me to believe that? It's the truth, she insisted, tears brimming in her eyes. I know I messed up, but I swear, it never got physical. The urge to believe her was strong, but the evidence didn't add up. Even if that's true, I said coldly, it doesn't make it better. You broke my trust, Sandra. You lied to me over and over again. I didn't mean to hurt you, she said, the tears finally spilling over. I felt so alone, Matthew. You've been so distant, always wrapped up in work or the kids. I didn't know how to tell you how I was feeling. That's not an excuse, I said firmly. I've been distant because I've been trying to hold this family together. Do you have any idea how much I've sacrificed for us? And while I'm out there breaking my back, you're cozying up to Jack like some lovesick teenager. Her tears turned to anger. You think this is all my fault, she snapped. You're not exactly perfect, Matthew. When was the last time you even noticed me? Or asked me how I was doing? You think just providing for us is enough? I needed more from you, but you were too busy to care. I felt the blood drain from my face. So this is my fault now? You're blaming me for your affair? I'm not saying it's your fault, she said, her voice softer now. But you can't act like you're some innocent victim here. We both let this marriage fall apart. Her words hit harder than I expected, but I wasn't about to let her rewrite the narrative. You don't get to rewrite what you did, Sandra. I didn't break our vows. I didn't sneak around with someone else. That was all you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Finally, Sandra broke it. What do you want me to say, Matthew? She asked, her voice hollow. Do you want me to beg for forgiveness? Because I will. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Fix this? I echoed, laughing bitterly. How do you propose we fix this, Sandra? Do we pretend like it never happened? Sweep it under the rug and move on? You think I can just forget what I saw? What I know? I don't know, she admitted, her shoulders slumping. I don't know what to do, Matthew. I just know I don't want to lose you. Her words, as heartfelt as they sounded, didn't carry the weight they once would have. Something inside me had shifted. The love I felt for her, the trust, the partnership, it was all fractured now, splintered into pieces I wasn't sure could ever be put back together. I need time, I said finally, my voice cold. Time to figure out if this marriage is even worth saving. Sandra nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Take all the time you need, she whispered. I'll do whatever it takes, Matthew. Just, don't give up on us. I didn't respond. I stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her alone at the table. Upstairs, I checked on Ella and Ben, both of them sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath their roof. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed me: what the hell do I do now? The morning after our confrontation, the house felt like a battlefield. Sandra avoided me, staying holed up in the guest room. The kids didn't notice anything unusual, which was a small relief, but it wouldn't last. The trust one once had in her was gone, and I knew that no amount of apologies or promises could bring it back. What I needed now was control of my emotions, my home, and this mess she had dragged me into. And, admittedly, I wanted her to feel a fraction of the pain she had caused me. I spent the next few days quietly planning my next steps. I wasn't going to let Sandra walk away from this without consequences, but I also wasn't going to act recklessly. If this was going to end, I needed to protect myself, my kids, and everything I'd worked for. The first step was securing proof. While Sandra claimed the affair hadn't been physical, I couldn't trust her word. She had already lied to me for months. That evening, after she went to bed, I installed a recovery app on her phone. It was something I'd read about online, a program designed to pull deleted messages and photos from the device. What I found confirmed my suspicions. Messages between her and Jack were filled with flirtation and innuendo, with a few blurry images attached that made my stomach turn. While there wasn't explicit proof of a physical relationship, the emotional connection was undeniable. I printed out the most damning messages and saved backups to my computer. The next step was protecting my financial interests. I scheduled an appointment with a divorce attorney, a hard-nosed professional named Carla who came highly recommended. She didn't waste time sugarcoating things. "If you want to come out of this intact, you need to act quickly," Carla said. "We'll need to freeze joint accounts, document all assets, and make sure your children's well-being is prioritized." By the time I left her office, I had a list of tasks to complete and a newfound sense of determination. I called my bank and arranged to transfer the bulk of our joint savings into an account under my name. It wasn't illegal, Carla assured me, as long as I left enough for Sandra to manage basic expenses. I wasn't trying to bankrupt her, just ensure she couldn't drain the account in a fit of spite. The most satisfying part of my plan was confronting Jack directly. I waited until a Saturday morning when Sandra had taken the kids to a soccer game. I knew Jack liked to work in his garden on weekends, so I walked over and caught him pruning rose bushes in his backyard. "Morning, Jack," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. He looked up, startled. "Oh, hey, Matthew. What brings you by?" "You know exactly what brings me by," I replied, stepping closer. "I know about you and Sandra." Jack's face turned pale, and he stammered, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't insult me," I snapped. "I've seen the messages. I know everything. So let's cut the crap." He put down his shears and rubbed his forehead, avoiding eye contact. "Look, Matthew, I swear we didn't." "Don't finish that sentence unless you're prepared to be honest," I interrupted. "I don't care if it was physical or not. The fact is, you crossed a line. You've been sneaking around with my wife like a coward." Jack raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm sorry, okay? It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "You didn't mean to hurt anyone?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think that makes it better? Do you have any idea what this has done to my family?" "I'll back off," he said quickly. "I'll stop seeing her, talking to her, whatever you want. Just don't make this worse." I leaned in close, lowering my voice. "If I ever see you near her again, I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows what kind of man you are. Do you understand me?" He nodded, visibly shaken. Satisfied, I turned and walked away, leaving him to stew in his guilt. That evening, I confronted Sandra again. I laid the printouts of her messages on the dining room table, letting her see the evidence for herself. "Explain this," I said coldly. Her face crumpled as she read the messages. "I told you it wasn't physical," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Matthew, Save it," I interrupted. "You've been lying to me for months. I'm done listening to your excuses." "What do you want from me?" she cried. "Do you want me to leave? Do you want a divorce?" "I want accountability," I said firmly. "I want you to admit what you've done, not just to me but to yourself." And then I want you to start packing. You can stay in the guest room for now, but this marriage is over." Sandra broke down, sobbing into her hands. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly drowned out by the anger and betrayal that had been festering inside me for weeks. Over the next few days, I began moving forward with the divorce. I informed the kids about the separation in the most delicate way I could, assuring them that none of this was their fault. Ella cried, and Ben didn't say much, but I could tell he was struggling to process the news. Sandra tried to engage with them, but I made it clear that I was taking primary custody. I wasn't about to let her instability disrupt their lives any more than it already had. With Carla's help, I filed the necessary paperwork and set the wheels in motion. The final piece of my revenge was small but satisfying. I dropped a manila envelope on Sandra's lap one evening, containing copies of the messages and photos I'd found. "Give this to your lawyer," I said. "It's all the evidence they'll need to understand why this marriage fell apart." She opened the envelope and stared at the contents, her face crumpling with shame. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "You're right," I said. "I didn't have to. But you didn't have to cheat." Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving her to sit with the consequences of her actions. Days turned into a week. The house felt like a cold, sterile battlefield. Sandra was still in the guest room, and our interactions were reduced to the bare minimum required to coordinate the kids' schedules. Ella and Ben were confused, their questions cautious but unavoidable. "Why is Mom sleeping in the guest room?" Ella asked one night while I was tucking her in. "We're going through a tough time," I replied, keeping my tone gentle. "But no matter what happens, we both love you and Ben very much." She nodded, not satisfied but too unsure to push further. It broke me to see her little shoulders sag as she hugged her stuffed bunny tighter. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Sandra approached me in the kitchen. She looked haggard, eyes red, hair unkempt, her usual grace replaced by the weight of everything crashing down around her. "We need to talk," she said softly. "About what?" I asked, not bothering to mask the edge in my voice. "About us." "About what happens next," she replied, pulling out a chair at the dining table. "Please, Matthew." I sat down across from her, crossing my arms. "I'm listening." Sandra took a deep breath, her hands trembling as they rested on the table. "I know I've made mistakes, huge ones. And I know I've hurt you in ways I can never undo. But I need to know if there's any part of you that still wants to try. For the kids' sake, if nothing else." "For the kids' sake," I repeated, shaking my head. "Sandra, do you even hear yourself? Staying together for the kids while pretending this didn't happen would only teach them that lying and betrayal are things you can sweep under the rug. That's not the kind of lesson I want them to learn." "I wasn't pretending," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought we could fix this. I thought we could find a way back to each other." "And what about Jack?" I asked bluntly. "Were you thinking about fixing things with me while you were texting him? While you were sneaking around?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her. "I told you it wasn't like that." "I don't care how you frame it," I said firmly. "You broke my trust. You made a choice, Sandra. And now you have to live with the consequences." Sandra's tears started falling, silent and slow. "I don't know what else to say to you," she whispered. "I'm sorry, Matthew. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I hurt you, and I'm sorry I hurt our family." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. For the first time, her apology felt real. It wasn't wrapped in excuses or half-truths. But it didn't change the fact that the damage was done. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But it doesn't change how I feel. This isn't something we can just move past. It's too big, Sandra." "So, that's it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're done? You're just going to throw away everything we've built? Throw it away?" I repeated, anger flaring again. "Do you even hear yourself? I wasn't the one who threw it away. That was you, the moment you decided Jack's attention was more important than your marriage." She opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, clearly realizing there was nothing she could say to argue the point. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said, breaking the heavy silence. "I'm filing for divorce. I'm also seeking primary custody of the kids." Sandra's head shot up, her eyes wide. "What? No. Matthew, you can't." "I can," I interrupted. "And I will. The kids need stability, Sandra. They need a parent they can trust." "You think I'm a bad mother?" she asked, her voice rising with a mix of anger and panic. "I think you made a series of selfish, reckless choices that prove you're not putting them first," I replied calmly. "I'm not saying you don't love them, but right now, you're not the example they need." Sandra's tears flowed freely now. "Please, Matthew. Don't do this. I'll do anything, therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't take my children from me." Her desperation was palpable, but I forced myself to stay firm. "I'm not taking them from you. You'll still have visitation, and we'll work out a fair schedule. But I'm not compromising on primary custody." Sandra's face crumpled, and she slumped forward, her head in her hands. "I never wanted this," she sobbed. "I never wanted to destroy our family." "Neither did I," said quietly. "But you did, Sandra. And now we have to figure out how to move forward." For a moment, I felt a pang of pity. Despite everything, this was the mother of my children, a woman I'd once loved deeply. But pity couldn't outweigh the betrayal. After a long pause, Sandra straightened up and wiped her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "I'll move forward with the divorce," I said. "You can stay in the guest room until we finalize everything. After that, we'll figure out living arrangements." She nodded, her expression resigned. "Okay," she said softly. "If that's what you need to do." "It is," I replied. "I need to put the kids first. And I need to put myself first for once." She stood, her shoulders hunched, and walked out of the room without another word. I sat at the table for a long time after she left, staring at the blank wall and wondering how it had all come to this. The kids would wake up the next day to a world that looked the same on the surface but was irreparably changed underneath. And while I hated what this would do to them, I knew it was the only way to ensure they grew up in a home where trust and respect mattered. The day I filed the divorce papers was quieter than I expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic farewell. Just a sterile exchange of documents between Carla, my lawyer, and me. By that point, the anger I'd felt had cooled into something harder, resolve. It wasn't the life I wanted, but it was the life I was left with. When Sandra was officially served, she didn't take it well. She called me, crying, accusing me of tearing our family apart. I listened without interrupting, but I didn't engage. I had said everything I needed to say. Now it was time for actions to replace words. The kids were the hardest part. Ella and Ben knew something was wrong before I told them, but the reality still hit them like a freight train. I sat them down one Saturday afternoon, Sandra conspicuously absent from the house. "Mom and I are getting a divorce," I said plainly. Their faces fell, the weight of the words sinking in slowly. "This doesn't change how much we love you, but we can't stay together anymore." Ella started crying immediately. "Why?" she asked through her tears. "What happened?" I hesitated. "Sometimes adults make mistakes," I said carefully. "And those mistakes make it impossible to stay married. But that doesn't mean we're not still a family." Ben was quiet, his face hard to read. "Do we have to move?" he asked, his tone flat. "No," I assured him. "You'll stay here, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. You'll still see Mom often, but I'll be here every day." He nodded but didn't say anything else. Ella clung to me, crying into my chest. I held her, feeling like the worst father in the world even though I knew this was the right decision. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, custody arrangements, and tense conversations with Sandra. She fought the divorce at first, claiming she still loved me and wanted to fix things. But her words rang hollow. You don't destroy trust like she did and expect it to be rebuilt overnight or at all. Carla helped me secure primary custody of the kids. Sandra was granted weekends and one weekday evening, a compromise that left her visibly deflated but was ultimately fair. I didn't do it to punish her. I did it because the kids needed stability, and I was the one providing it. Sandra moved out a month later, renting a small apartment a few miles away. She tried to make it seem like a fresh start, decorating the place with bright colors and new furniture. But every time I dropped off Ella and Ben, I could see the strain on her face. She was struggling, and part of me pitied her. But pity didn't change anything. In the evenings, after the kids were asleep, I'd sit alone in the living room and think about everything that had happened. It was hard not to spiral, replaying every moment, every conversation, wondering what I could have done differently. Could I have worked less? Paid more attention? Would that have stopped Sandra from turning to Jack? The truth was, I'd never know. Maybe I had failed in ways I didn't fully understand. But Sandra had made choices too. Choices that broke the foundation of our marriage beyond repair. The house became mine in the divorce settlement. At first, I thought about selling it, too many memories, too much pain. But Ella and Ben loved the place, and I couldn't bear to uproot them more than they already had been. So I stayed, turning the guest room into an office and slowly replacing furniture Sandra had picked out with pieces that felt more like me. Work became my escape. I poured myself into every project, taking on extra hours to keep my mind occupied. But I didn't let it consume me like I had in the past. The kids came first now. Every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every bedtime story, I was there. They needed stability, and I was determined to give it to them. Sandra tried to reach out a few times. She'd text me late at night, long messages filled with regret and apologies. At first, I ignored them. Then I started responding, short and to the point. "I understand you're sorry," I wrote once. "But that doesn't change what happened. I've moved on, Sandra. I hope you can too." She never replied to that one. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I met someone. Her name was Claire, a single mom I met at one of Ben's soccer practices. She was smart, kind, and funny in a way that caught me off guard. We started talking during games, then over coffee. It was slow and cautious, but it felt good, like something I hadn't realized I was missing. I didn't rush to introduce her to the kids. That was a bridge I wasn't ready to cross yet. But knowing there was life after Sandra was a revelation. I wasn't broken. I wasn't doomed to be alone forever. There was hope, even if it felt fragile. Sandra and I don't talk much now. When we do, it's strictly about the kids. She's still trying to rebuild her life, and I hope she succeeds. Not for her sake, but for Ella and Ben's. They deserve a mother who's whole. As for me, I'm still figuring things out. Some days are hard, the loneliness creeping in when the house is too quiet. But most days, I feel okay. Maybe even happy. And that's enough for now.